The silence before the storm. The towering doors of the Jefferson County Courthouse stood weathered with age, the wood darkened from years of storms, sun, and secrets. Their iron handles were worn smooth, touched by countless hands, some trembling, some defiant, some too young to even understand the weight they carried. This morning, those handles were pushed open by a woman whose hands bore both strength and exhaustion, her grip firm yet gentle on the small hand within her own. Ruth Collins, a former teacher turned guardian, guided 7-year-old Ava Green into the courthouse lobby, where polished marble floors reflected the dim morning light. The child's small patent leather shoes squeaked faintly with every hesitant step, her navy blue dress swaying around her knees. Ava's hair, a cascade of dark curls tied back with a pale yellow ribbon, seemed too bright a spot in a place this cold. She clutched a worn, one-eyed teddy bear close to her chest, its faded fur dark with age and comfort. The courthouse air was thick with the scent of old paper, polished wood, and something less tangible, an undercurrent of expectation, like the moment before a storm breaks. Ruth could feel every eye turn their way, the weight of curiosity and speculation bearing down like a suffocating fog. Ava felt it too. Ruth could see it in the way the child's shoulders curled inward, trying to shrink into invisibility. "Stay close, baby," Ruth whispered, squeezing Ava's hand gently. The little girl didn't speak, only gave a small, jerky nod, her dark eyes darting to the row of wooden benches lining the back wall of the courtroom. People were already seated, townsfolk, reporters, community leaders who had come not for justice, but for the spectacle. Whispers wove through the air, thin and sharp as needles. At the front of the room, the defendant's table stood empty for now, waiting like a hungry beast. A stack of papers, the weight of a man's life compressed into thin sheets, sat waiting for the public defender to arrive. Ruth's gaze drifted past the table to the defendant's chair, the metal shackles resting heavily against the polished wood armrests. The sight of them twisted her stomach into knots. A loud clatter startled Ava, and she jumped, her bear slipping from her grasp to the floor. Ruth bent quickly to pick it up, but the girl was faster, clutching the toy and holding it close again. Her tiny hands trembled. At precisely 9:02 a.m., the side door creaked open, and Jeremiah Green was led into the courtroom. His broad shoulders strained against the ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, the institutional fabric at odds with the quiet dignity he carried in his every step. The chains at his wrists and ankles clinked with each movement, the sound somehow louder than the murmurs around them. Jeremiah's eyes, dark and hollow, lifted as he scanned the room. When they landed on Ava, something broke, just for a moment. The mask of indifference he had worn through countless hearings, arraignments, and interrogations. His hands twitched at his sides, the instinct to reach for her warring with the brutal knowledge that he couldn't. Ava didn't move. She stood frozen at Ruth's side, the bear clutched to her chest like a shield. But her eyes, those big liquid eyes, never left her father's face. The courtroom door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "All rise," the bailiff's voice rang out. The room stood, though not without the creaking of old knees and the rustling of worn jackets. Judge Marion Lowe, a woman whose career had been built on an unwavering dedication to order, swept into the room, her black robes flowing behind her like ink spilling across a page. Her silver hair was twisted into a severe knot, every strand perfectly in place. Her expression gave away nothing, but Ruth had spent enough time in classrooms to know how to spot doubt hiding beneath authority. "Be seated," Judge Lowe said, her voice flat, almost weary. The shuffle of bodies settling filled the room, followed by silence so thick it felt physical. The prosecutor, Even Cartwright, rose to his feet. He was younger than most prosecutors Ruth had seen. His hair still dark, his suit perfectly pressed, but his eyes were sharp with ambition. Every step he took toward the jury box was deliberate, every gesture choreographed to convey certainty and conviction. Ruth recognized the type. She'd seen it in students who were more concerned with being right than being just. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Cartwright began, his voice rich with manufactured solemnity, "the man before you is no ordinary defendant." Jeremiah's shoulders tensed, his jaw tight. Cartwright paced slowly, his footsteps a metronome measuring out the destruction of a man's life. Jeremiah Green has a history of violence, of resentment, of dangerous impulses, and on the night of July 14th, that history erupted into flames. Ava's small hands curled tighter around the bear. Ruth leaned down, her lips close to the child's ear. "It's okay, baby. I'm right here." But Ava's eyes were glued to her father. Cartwright continued, his voice building. "The evidence will show that Mr. Green set fire to St. Thomas Chapel, a beloved pillar of this community. And in doing so, he destroyed not just a building, but the heart of this neighborhood." The jury, a collection of men and women Ruth had known from grocery store aisles and PTA meetings, sat with faces already half decided. She could see it in their set jaws and folded arms. Cartwright's words were bricks, building a wall between them and the truth. At the defense table, Edward Mills, Jeremiah's court-appointed attorney, shuffled through his papers with the air of a man already defeated. His suit was rumpled, his hair thinning, his glasses sliding down his nose. He looked up at Jeremiah, but Jeremiah didn't meet his gaze. His eyes remained locked on his daughter. "The prosecution calls Officer Stephen Haywood to the stand," Cartwright announced. The side door opened, and Haywood stepped in, a man with a chest like a barrel and a mustache that looked more like a threat than facial hair. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a blinding shine. The kind of cop who prided himself on getting his man, whether the evidence fit or not. Ruth watched Ava flinch slightly at the sound of Haywood's boots clicking across the floor. This was the man who had pulled Jeremiah from their small apartment in the middle of the night, who had cuffed him in front of Ava, his voice booming threats that the child could never unhear. Haywood raised his right hand, swore the oath, and took his seat. "Officer Haywood," Cartwright began, "please describe what you saw the night of the fire." Haywood leaned forward, his hands folded over his ample stomach. "I was on patrol near Maple Street when I saw Mr. Green walking away from the chapel. Smoke was already rising from the roof. When I called out to him, he ran." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. "Did you pursue him?" "Yes, sir." "And what did you find when you caught up to him?" "His clothes smelled like gasoline." The murmur grew louder. Ruth clenched her jaw. She knew that night Jeremiah hadn't been running from a crime. He'd been running home, running to Ava. As Cartwright continued, Ava's grip on Ruth's hand tightened until her knuckles went white. The little girl's shoulders shook, but she made no sound. Her eyes flicked from her father, to the officer, to the judge, to the jury, taking it all in, filing it away like only children who have been forced to grow up too soon can do. Then, as Cartwright prepared to call his next witness, Ava suddenly released Ruth's hand. Without warning, the tiny girl stepped forward, her footsteps soft but deliberate. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears it drowned out the noise around her. She reached the center of the room, standing before the judge, the prosecutor, and the man in shackles. Ava lifted her chin, her voice trembling but clear. "Daddy." The courtroom exploded. The storm had broken. The weight of one word, the single word, "Daddy," hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, ringing louder than the judge's gavel or the echoing murmurs from the gallery. That single syllable, trembling but clear, stopped time. For a moment, there was silence so profound it felt unnatural, like the world itself had held its breath. The reporters, the townspeople, the jury, they all stared at the tiny girl standing alone in the center of the room, her navy blue dress trembling at the hem, her small hands clenched at her sides. Then the explosion came. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of wooden benches against the floor as half the room rose to their feet. Reporters tripped over each other to grab microphones. Cameras clicking wildly as if they could capture the exact second truth collided with performance. Ruth shot up from her seat, heart slamming into her ribs, but Ava stood firm. The courtroom's chaos washed around her dark curls trembling against her shoulders, but she didn't flinch. At the defendant's table, Jeremiah's breath left him in a single shuddering gasp. His shackled hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles blanched. That word, that voice, was hope and agony all at once. His chest heaved with emotion too big to name, and his knees wobbled beneath him. But the chains held him upright. Judge Marion Lowe's gavel slammed once, twice, 3 times, each crack sharper than the last. Order! Order in this courtroom! Her voice, honed through decades of holding chaos at bay, finally cut through the roar. The gallery noise fell into a nervous hush, but the air crackled with the weight of what had just happened. Ruth finally moved, stepping forward to the edge of the gallery. "Ava, baby, come here," she whispered, reaching for her. But Ava didn't move, not yet. The judge's eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, peering down at the girl. Her expression was unreadable, but something flickered there, something Ruth couldn't quite name: concern or curiosity. "Miss Collins," Judge Lowe said, her voice slower, deliberate. "What is the meaning of this?" Ruth's throat went dry. I didn't know she was going to speak, Your Honor." The judge's gaze shifted back to Ava. "Come here, sweetheart." The bailiff, a burly man with a kind face, stepped forward and offered his hand. Ava hesitated, looking to Ruth for permission. Ruth nodded, though her heart screamed for her to run and gather the girl up, to shield her from all of this. Tiny patent leather shoes clicked against the floor as Ava walked up the 3 wooden steps to the witness box. The microphone stood too high for her, so the bailiff quietly adjusted it down until it was level with her trembling lips. The room held its breath. "What did you just say, child?" Judge Lowe asked gently, her tone warmer now, though her fingers still gripped the edge of her bench with white-knuckle tension. Ava's breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling too quickly, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "He's my daddy." The room's collective gasp was audible, even though everyone had already heard it once. Judge Lowe's expression darkened, not with anger, but with calculation. Miss Collins approached the bench. Ruth hurried forward, her shoes squeaking on the polished wood. Ava's wide eyes followed her every step. "Is this true?" the judge asked in a low voice meant only for Ruth. Ruth swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor. Jeremiah Green is her biological father." "And why?" The judge's tone sharpened. "Has this not been disclosed to the court?" Ruth's fingers twisted together. There was never a chance. His attorney didn't think it was relevant to the arson case, and there were safety concerns. The judge's brow arched. What kind of safety concerns? Ruth's hesitation was brief, but it was enough for the judge to see through her. There were threats, Ruth admitted quietly. Anonymous notes, phone calls, all warning me to keep Ava quiet, to keep her out of the courtroom. The judge's grip on the bench tightened, but her face remained impassive. "Return to your seat, Miss Collins." Ruth turned and gathered Ava into her arms, lifting her down from the witness box. She could feel the little girl's heart pounding against her chest, her small body trembling from the weight of what she'd just done. But Ava was strong, stronger than anyone realized. Behind the curtain, in the hallway just outside the courtroom, a man in a charcoal gray suit leaned against the wall, a phone pressed to his ear. Charles Whitmore, property developer and local kingmaker, stared through the narrow window in the courtroom door, his jaw clenched so tightly a vein throbbed at his temple. "You told me they wouldn't let the kid speak," Whitmore hissed into the phone. On the other end, silence. Whitmore's fingers drummed against his leg, a quick, erratic rhythm. "I don't care what it takes. Shut this down. Do you understand me?" The voice on the other end was low, measured. "It's already unraveling, Charles." Whitmore's lips curled into a snarl. "Then pull the last string and let it all fall. The missing puzzle piece. Back inside the courtroom, Public Defender Edward Mills was finally on his feet, his face red and sweaty as he fumbled with his papers. He was woefully unprepared for this turn of events. A child on the witness stand, a father in chains, and a jury seeing it all unfold live. "Your Honor," Mills began, voice cracking, "the defense requests a recess to confer with my client." Judge Lowe glanced at the prosecutor, even Cartwright, who was still standing at his table, shell-shocked. Cartwright had prepared for a simple arson trial, not a revelation of paternity, threats, and what was beginning to look like a cover-up. "Request granted," the judge said. "We will recess for 30 minutes." The gavel fell, but no one moved. The gallery sat stunned, like an audience who had just seen a play spiral off script. Jeremiah turned, chains rattling, and his eyes locked onto Ruth's. His voice was low, broken, but clear. "You kept her safe." Ruth's throat closed with emotion. She could only nod. But Ava was the one who took a step forward, past the rail dividing the public from the defendant's table. She didn't ask permission. She just walked right up to her father. The guards moved to stop her, but Judge Lowe held up a hand. "Let her." Ava stood at the edge of the table, her small hands gripping the polished wood. "Are you mad at me?" she whispered. Jeremiah's whole body shook with the effort to keep himself together. "No, baby," he rasped. "Not even a little." She reached out her hand, the same small hand that had gripped Ruth's so tightly, and Jeremiah reached for her. The chains between his wrists prevented him from taking her hand fully, but their fingers brushed, skin to skin, warmth to warmth. And for the first time since his arrest, Jeremiah Green cried. A clock ticking down. While the courtroom emptied for recess, Ruth pulled Ava into the hallway, her mind racing. There were too many questions. Why had someone tried so hard to keep Ava silent? What was the connection between the arson, the church, and the threats? What did Jeremiah know, or who was trying to make sure no one ever found out? The answers were out there, and Ruth was done being afraid. As she held Ava close, the little girl's hand still trembling in hers, Ruth realized the storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Secrets in the smoke. The heavy doors of the courthouse conference room groaned shut behind Ruth as she ushered Ava inside. The child's small hand trembled in hers, the weight of her brave outburst still clinging to her narrow shoulders like a too heavy coat. Ava's curls, once neatly tied back, had slipped free during the chaos, framing her face in wild, dark spirals. Her wide eyes darted between the unfamiliar room and her father, who shuffled in behind them, shackles dragging across the floor like broken promises. Jeremiah hadn't spoken since Ava had called him daddy in front of the whole courtroom. His hands, still cuffed, rested on the chipped wooden table, fingers flexing slightly, as if grasping for a comfort long denied him. His jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, the body of a man who carried guilt like weight, wearing him down until his bones felt too fragile to hold his skin in place. Edward Mills, his court-appointed attorney, collapsed into a chair at the far end of the table, already sweating through his thin dress shirt. His briefcase sat open before him, a mess of crumpled notes, coffee-stained legal pads, and a half-eaten granola bar. 30 minutes, Mills muttered, rifling through the papers. "I need 30 days to prepare for whatever just happened out there." Jeremiah didn't respond. His gaze was locked on Ava, drinking her in like a man starved for sunlight. "Daddy," Ava whispered, her voice fragile, like the crack of thin ice. Jeremiah opened his mouth, but no words came out. It was Ruth who stepped forward, kneeling beside Ava so they were eye level. "Baby, why did you say that in front of everyone?" Her voice was gentle, but the urgency trembled just beneath the surface. Ava's brow furrowed, and her small hands twisted in the hem of her dress. "Because it's true," she said simply. Ruth's heart clenched. There was no malice in Ava's words, no intention to disrupt, just a child's simple, unflinching honesty. She reached out, smoothing a curl away from Ava's face. "But why now, sweet girl? Why today?" Ava's lip quivered. "I heard the bad man on the phone. He said Daddy would never get out if nobody knew." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. "What bad man, Davy?" Ava looked at the table, eyes downcast. "The man with the shiny watch." Jeremiah's chains rattled as he shifted, the color draining from his face. "Charles Whitmore," he said hoarsely. Ruth's stomach turned. She knew that name. Everyone did. Whitmore wasn't just a property developer. He was the invisible hand pulling the strings across the county. From land deals to elections, if Whitmore wanted you silenced, you disappeared. "When did you hear him, baby?" Ruth pressed, her voice soft but urgent. Ava's eyes flicked up to her father's. "At the house, before they took you away." Jeremiah's fists clenched. His memory flickered. The night they arrested him. How the cops arrived too quickly, almost like they'd been waiting. How Ava had been crying, but not just because of the police, because someone had already been there. "You saw him?" Jeremiah asked, his voice raw. Ava nodded. He was outside, talking to the man in the uniform. Mills straightened, his eyes narrowing. "Wait, you're saying Whitmore was there with the police?" Jeremiah let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp as broken glass. "Of course he was. I've been saying from the beginning, this was bigger than me." Ruth's mind spun. The case against Jeremiah had always felt too neat, an arson charge built like a house of cards, balanced on weak evidence and a hasty investigation. Now, with Ava's revelation, the whole thing teetered on collapse. "We have to tell the judge," Ruth said. "No." Jeremiah's voice cut through the room like a knife. "We can't just tell them. They'll bury it. We need proof." Mills wiped his damp forehead with a crumpled napkin. "And where exactly are we supposed to find proof?" "We're on recess, not a full investigation." Jeremiah's eyes met Ruth's. "I know where to look." The smoke trail. 15 minutes later, Ruth and Ava sat in the hallway outside the conference room, while Mills and Jeremiah spoke in hushed tones. The child leaned against Ruth's side, her small hand wrapped tightly around Ruth's thumb, her head resting against her arm. "Are you in trouble, baby girl?" Ruth asked softly, brushing a thumb across Ava's cheek. Ava shook her head. "I just wanted everyone to know." Tears burned in Ruth's eyes. "You were so brave, sweetheart." Ava's fingers tightened. "I didn't want Daddy to be alone." Ruth pulled her close, heart swelling with equal parts pride and fear. "He won't be." The conference room door creaked open, and Mills waved Ruth back inside. Jeremiah stood, his chains temporarily unlocked so he could stretch, his fingers flexing like a man relearning how to hold hope. "I need you to get something for me," Jeremiah said quietly. Ruth's brow knit. "What is it?" "There's a storage locker on the east side of town," Jeremiah said. "Unit 27A. It's in my name, but I gave the spare key to someone before all this." Ruth felt her stomach drop. "Who?" Jeremiah's expression softened. "Ava." Ruth turned to the little girl, who reached into her small dress pocket and pulled out a rusted brass key, the teeth worn down from years of handling. She held it out, her lip trembling slightly. "I kept it safe," Ava whispered. Jeremiah's breath hitched. "You did good, baby girl." Ruth took the key, feeling its weight settle into her palm. "What's in there?" Jeremiah's jaw tightened. "The truth." Shadows in storage. Later that afternoon, while the courtroom waited for the recess to end, Ruth made a quiet phone call to Mrs. Gardner, the kind neighbor who often babysat Ava. Within the hour, Ava was safely curled up with a plate of cookies, under the watchful eye of the elderly woman, leaving Ruth free to chase the truth. The storage facility was a forgotten corner of town, the kind of place where things went to disappear. Old furniture, broken dreams, pieces of lives packed in dust. Ruth's footsteps echoed against cracked concrete as she approached Unit 27A. The lock, rusted but intact, clicked open with the turn of Ava's key. The door groaned upward, revealing dim light filtering through slats, illuminating a single metal filing cabinet and a battered cardboard box. Ruth's heart pounded in her ears as she approached the cabinet. Its drawers were labeled in Jeremiah's tight, slanted handwriting. Church records, property disputes, Whitmore dealings. The names alone made her stomach knot. She opened the Whitmore drawer, her hands trembling. Inside were copies of letters, purchase offers, and, at the very back, a cassette tape. The label read, July 14, Church Fire. Ruth's breath caught. This was it, proof that Jeremiah hadn't set the fire, but had been trying to stop it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Mills, telling her court was resuming in 10 minutes. Ruth grabbed the tape and the file, slammed the locker shut, and ran for her car. The courtroom's turn. When Ruth burst back into the courtroom, breathless and flushed, the judge had already taken her seat. Jeremiah sat at the defense table, his shackles back in place. But when Ruth slid into the seat behind him, holding up the tape, his eyes went wide. The clock struck 4:00 p.m. All rise, the bailiff called. As the court came to order, Ruth held the tape tighter, her knuckles white with tension. This was the moment they had waited for, the chance to burn the lies down and finally let the truth rise from the ashes. And as Ava peered up at her from the gallery bench, Ruth realized something else. They weren't just fighting for Jeremiah. They were fighting for Ava's future. Fire, lies, and fragile truths. The air in the courthouse felt heavier than usual when Ruth returned. Her fingers curled so tightly around the small cassette tape that her knuckles turned bone-white. The tape was old, edges worn from years of being handled and hidden. Yet it felt like it radiated heat, not from age, but from the weight of secrets it held. Ruth slipped into her seat directly behind Jeremiah. She didn't speak, but she placed her hand gently on his shoulder. The chain binding his wrist clinked softly as he shifted in his chair. His fingers, shaking slightly, curled over hers for just a moment. No words were needed. That single touch, rough hand over soft, trembling one, said everything. He saw the tape. His breath caught. He knew what it meant. All rise. The bailiff's voice rang out, cutting through the tension. Judge Lowe entered, her face set like carved stone, but Ruth caught something behind her eyes. Curiosity, yes, but also suspicion. The events of the morning had unraveled something in the judge's mind, like a loose thread she couldn't ignore. As the courtroom settled, even Cartwright, the ambitious prosecutor, stood with his usual performative flourish. But there was a subtle crack in his confidence now. His fingers tapped nervously at the corner of his notes, his glances darting more often toward Ruth and the defense table. Your Honor, Cartwright began, his voice smooth but a little too loud, as if overcompensating. The prosecution was not informed that the defense would be introducing new evidence today. Edward Mills stood up slowly, uncharacteristically confident. That's because we only just discovered it, Your Honor. Discovered? Cartwright's eyes narrowed. What exactly was discovered? Ruth stood, clearing her throat. Your Honor, I was given access to a storage unit belonging to Jeremiah Green. Inside, I found this. She held up the cassette tape. The gallery leaned in, a ripple of whispered curiosity sweeping through the room. Judge Lowe's brow arched. And what exactly is on that tape? We believe, Mills said, it's a recording made the night of the fire, evidence that not only exonerates Mr. Green, but implicates someone else. Cartwright's composure slipped for the briefest second, his smile faltering like a mask losing its grip. Your Honor, I object to the introduction of this evidence without proper verification. Overruled, Judge Lowe said, her gaze sharp as steel. The court will recess for 30 minutes to allow this tape to be authenticated. The gavel fell, and Ruth exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ava's secret memory. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Ruth knelt in front of Ava, who sat curled up on a wooden bench, her fingers toying with the edge of her dress. "Baby, I need you to tell me something," Ruth said softly. Ava's eyes flicked up, guarded. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, sweet girl," Ruth reassured her, tucking a curl behind Ava's ear. "But I need you to think real hard. That night, the night the fire started, you said you saw a man with a shiny watch. Did you hear him say anything?" Ava chewed her lower lip, the memory clearly something she tucked away somewhere deep and safe. "He was talking on the phone," she whispered. "I was supposed to be in bed, but I couldn't sleep." Ruth nodded encouragingly. "Do you remember what he said?" Ava's brow furrowed, her hands gripping her dress tighter. "He said, make sure he's inside before it goes up." Then he laughed. "He said, loose ends don't get second chances." Ruth's stomach twisted. "Are you sure, baby?" Ava's dark eyes were steady, too old for her face. "I remember." The judge's office, 30 minutes later. The small cassette player sat on Judge Lowe's desk, an old scuffed relic hauled out from some forgotten evidence locker. The tape was inserted, ready to play. Ruth, Jeremiah, Mills, Cartwright, and Judge Lowe were the only ones in the room, a deliberately closed circle. Ruth's pulse pounded in her ears as the judge pressed play. At first, there was only static, the faint hiss of an old recording. Then, a voice. Male. Cold. "Is it ready?" Ruth's breath caught. Another voice responded. Familiar. Smug. "We poured the accelerant along the back wall and the nave. Once the candles hit it, it'll go up fast. Just need to make sure our guy's close enough to get blamed." Ruth's heart stopped. The first voice again. And the daughter. Too young to talk, and her guardians easy to scare. They'll stay quiet if they know what's good for them. No one will believe a kid if she says anything anyway. Jeremiah's hands curled into fists on his lap. There was the crackle of a lighter, the distant roar of flames, then a laugh. Charles Whitmore's unmistakable laugh. The tape clicked off. The room was dead silent. Cartwright's face was bloodless, his lips pressed so tight they almost disappeared. Judge Lowe's fingers steepled beneath her chin. "Mr. Cartwright, would you like to explain why your office presented this case, so confidently knowing evidence like this existed?" Cartwright stammered. His slick confidence evaporated. I didn't know." "Didn't you?" Judge Lowe's voice was a whip crack. "Or didn't you look?" The prosecutor's silence was damning. Outside the courthouse, a storm brewing. Whitmore's black SUV idled outside the courthouse, the engine a soft, constant rumble. Inside, Charles Whitmore sat with a glass of scotch resting against the dashboard, the ice clinking as he swirled it absently. His phone buzzed. "Report. They found the tape." Whitmore's fingers tightened around the glass until the crystal creaked. "And there's more. The girl. She remembers." The scotch glass shattered in his hand, amber liquid running down his fingers like blood. "Fix it," Whitmore hissed, his voice low and venomous, "before it gets to the jury." The line went dead. The courtroom returns. The gallery was packed tighter than before when the court reconvened. Rumors had already leaked that something big was happening. The air crackled with anticipation. Judge Lowe took her seat, her expression unreadable. "This court has reviewed new evidence," she began, her voice carrying through the silent room. "The integrity of this case has been compromised in a profound way." Cartwright sat pale and sweating, his hands trembling on his legal pad. "I am ordering an immediate suspension of all proceedings pending a full investigation into prosecutorial misconduct and suppression of evidence," Judge Lowe said firmly. Gasps rippled through the room. Jeremiah's head fell into his hands, emotion trembling through his broad shoulders. "But," Judge Lowe added, "given the nature of the evidence, and in the interest of justice, I am also ordering the immediate release of Jeremiah Green." The room erupted. Ava leaped from her seat, feet pounding the floor as she sprinted toward the defendant's table. Jeremiah barely had time to rise before she collided into him, her tiny arms locking around his waist, her face buried in his chest. "Daddy." Her voice broke into a sob, her small frame shaking with relief and confusion. Jeremiah knelt, wrapping his arms around her as tightly as the chains had once bound him. Ruth watched, tears flooding her eyes as father and daughter clung to each other like lifelines. Jeremiah's whispered words were meant only for Ava, but Ruth heard them all the same. "I'm here now, baby girl. I'm here. The shadow still lurks." But outside the courthouse, Whitmore's SUV pulled away from the curb, its dark windows reflecting the cheering crowd on the steps. His face, tight with rage, was invisible behind the glass. This wasn't over. Not yet. Shadows in the light. The cheers outside the courthouse faded into the background as Ruth, Ava, and Jeremiah slipped through a side exit, avoiding the crush of reporters swarming the front steps. Ruth gripped Ava's hand tightly, her heart still hammering from the judge's words. Immediate release. The words were a victory, but they felt fragile, too light to hold the weight of everything that had happened. Freedom was one thing. Safety was another. Jeremiah's newly unshackled hands shook at his sides as they crossed the sun-drenched parking lot. The sun felt too bright, the world too loud after the silence of a cell. He hadn't touched grass in months, and the soft scuff of Ava's shoes on the pavement brought tears he couldn't quite blink away. "Where are we going?" Ava asked, her voice small. Ruth squeezed her hand. "Somewhere safe. Home." Ava's voice was hopeful. Jeremiah and Ruth exchanged a glance. Home wasn't safe. Not yet. "Soon, baby," Jeremiah said, but not yet. They reached Ruth's aging sit-in, and Jeremiah stood awkwardly beside it, unsure whether to climb into the passenger seat or the back. His whole body moved like a man expecting handcuffs at any moment. Ruth opened the front door for him, the gesture both practical and symbolic. He was a free man, but for how long? Ava climbed into the back, clutching her bear tight, her wide eyes darting to every shadow in the parking lot. Even the rustling leaves seemed ominous now, as if something, or someone, hid just out of sight. Ruth started the engine, but her fingers trembled on the steering wheel. Through the rearview mirror, she saw it, a black SUV, parked just across the street, its windows tinted so dark they were mirrors. "Is that?" Jeremiah's voice was low, but Ruth didn't need him to finish the question. "I don't know," she murmured, forcing the car into reverse. Ava craned her neck, her gaze fixed on the SUV until Ruth turned the corner and it disappeared from view. But it would be back. They all knew it. The safe house. Ruth drove out of town, past neighborhoods and strip malls, until the roads turned narrower and the trees closed in. They passed the old gas station with the rusted sign, the field where the church once held Easter egg hunts, and a collapsed barn whose skeletal frame jutted out of the earth like broken ribs. Finally, they reached the small, weathered cabin Ruth had inherited from her father, a place no one knew about. The cabin sat half-hidden beneath towering pines, its cedar siding darkened by years of storms. It smelled like moss and earth, the scent of something rooted deep in the land. The gravel driveway crunched under the tires as Ruth pulled in, cutting the engine. "This was your dad's place?" Jeremiah asked, stepping out. Ruth nodded. "Haven't been here in years." Ava scrambled out, her bear tucked under her arm. "It's kinda spooky." Ruth gave her a tired smile. "A little." They unloaded what little they had. A bag of clothes Ruth had hurriedly packed for Ava that morning, a box of supplies from the trunk. There was no television, no internet, just a landline, a wood stove, and a dusty collection of books lining the shelves. It felt cut off from the world. Safe, but fragile. Ruth lit a fire to chase the dampness from the air, and Ava curled up on the threadbare couch, her feet tucked under her. Jeremiah stood at the window, arms folded, watching the narrow dirt road they'd come down, like he expected headlights to appear at any second. "You think it's over, don't you?" he said softly. Ruth didn't answer. She knew better. The warning call. The landline rang at exactly 10:17 p.m., a shrill, unnatural sound cutting through the quiet hum of crickets outside. Ruth's heart leaped into her throat as she crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. She lifted the receiver, her hand shaking. "Hello." At first, nothing. Just silence, thick and heavy, like someone was waiting. Then, "You should have left it alone." The voice was distorted, mechanical, untraceable. Ruth's knuckles went white. "Who is this?" The line went dead. Jeremiah stood behind her now, his shadow looming over her shoulder. Was it him? "I don't know," Ruth whispered. "But someone knows we're here." Memories and ash. Jeremiah sat at the small kitchen table, the wood grain worn smooth beneath his fingertips. He hadn't been to the cabin since he was 17, when Ruth's father had let him spend a summer fixing up the back deck in exchange for a few dollars and a hot meal. That was before everything fell apart, before arrests and fires and deals made in the dark. Ruth placed a chipped mug of coffee in front of him. "I'm sorry, it's instant." "It's good," Jeremiah said, even though it wasn't. Ava had fallen asleep on the couch, her bear clutched tight, her breathing soft. Jeremiah's gaze rested on her, his chest tightening. "She's so big," he said quietly. "She waited for you," Ruth said. Jeremiah swallowed hard. "I don't deserve that." "Maybe," Ruth said softly. "But you've got it." For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, the wood settling with soft pops and sighs. Outside, the night seemed too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "I didn't set that fire," Jeremiah said at last, his voice low. "I know." Ruth's hand covered his, her fingers warm. "We're going to prove it. The hunter becomes the hunted." Somewhere across town, Charles Whitmore sat in his study, the glow from his laptop the only light in the room. His hand, wrapped in a bandage from the broken Scotch glass, rested on the desk beside a file folder labeled Green Case. Inside were photos. Grainy surveillance images of Ruth, Jeremiah, and Ava leaving the courthouse. A printed map highlighted the road leading to Ruth's cabin. Whitmore's jaw clenched. They could run, but he would always find them. His phone buzzed. "The sheriff is asking questions," a voice said. "They're starting to poke around your connection to the property deals." "Then shut it down," Whitmore snapped. A pause. "They're going to talk to your old investigator." Whitmore's stomach twisted. That was a loose end. And loose ends got cut. A knock at midnight. It was past midnight when the knock came, sharp and deliberate against the old cabin door. Ruth shot upright, heart hammering. Jeremiah was at the window instantly, peering into the darkness. Ava stirred, but didn't wake. Ruth crossed to the door. "Who is it?" she called, voice low. "It's me," a familiar voice answered. "Detective Briggs." Jeremiah's jaw tensed, but Ruth opened the door. Briggs stood there, rain dripping from his jacket, his face drawn and serious. "I followed a car here," he said quietly. "Black SUV. They're watching the road." Ruth's breath caught. "Whitmore." Briggs nodded. "They want to make sure you don't talk." Jeremiah stepped forward. "You believe us now?" Briggs's smile was grim. "I believe someone wants you dead." "That's good enough for me." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, sealing the four of them inside a house that suddenly felt too small for the storm outside. "We have to end this," Ruth whispered. Briggs nodded. "But first, we have to survive the night." Outside, headlights flickered through the trees. Truths that rise from the ashes. The rain had come fast, sweeping in from the hills like a warning whispered through the trees. The roof of Ruth's cabin ticked with the steady rhythm of water, each droplet sliding down the old wood like secrets too heavy to hold. Inside, the fire in the wood stove cast a flickering glow, but it couldn't touch the cold knot forming in the center of Ruth's chest. They were out there, somewhere beyond the tree line, watching. waiting. Ava slept on the couch, her bear tucked tight under her chin, blissfully unaware that her world was balanced on the sharp edge of danger. Jeremiah sat at the window, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the dark for shadows that moved when they shouldn't. The weight of his freedom had been replaced with something heavier. Survival. Detective Briggs stood by the door, hand resting near the gun holstered at his hip. He was no stranger to threats, but the weight of this particular night felt personal. This wasn't about catching bad guys or closing cases. This was about keeping a little girl safe. "They're out there," Jeremiah said quietly. Briggs gave a grim nod. "I know." Ruth sat at the table, the cassette tape beside her. Its presence like a heartbeat, steady, inescapable. That tiny spool of tape held everything, not just Jeremiah's truth, but Ava's future, Ruth's peace, and the legacy of Street Thomas Chapel, burned to the ground to feed a greedy man's ambition. "Whitmore won't let us walk away," Ruth said. Jeremiah turned from the window, his jaw tight. "He'll have to kill me to get to her." The words were quiet, but the force behind them shook Ruth's spine. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. "You don't have to fight this alone." Jeremiah's gaze softened, and for a flicker of a second, the weight on his shoulders seemed to shift, just enough for hope to slip through the cracks. But then, crack, the snap of a twig. Jeremiah shot to his feet. Briggs drew his weapon, his back to the door. Ava stirred on the couch, her brow furrowing in sleep. "Mama Ruth," she whispered. Ruth crossed the room in 2 steps, kneeling beside her, her hand on the child's cheek. "It's okay, baby. Go back to sleep." Another noise, this one closer. Boots in mud. They were coming. A flash of light. The first burst of light came from the road, the glare of high beams cutting through the misty rain. Then a second pair, and a third. 3 black SUVs crept down the dirt drive like predators stalking prey. "They found us," Jeremiah said, his voice flat. Briggs stood firm. "They're not getting past me." Ruth's heart slammed against her ribs, but her mind stayed sharp. "We need to get Ava out of here." "No," Jeremiah said. "We end this. Tonight." Ruth knew there was no arguing. Not with the fear in his eyes, and the fire beneath it. They'd spent too many years running. It was time to turn and fight. The face of power. The SUVs stopped in the clearing, engines humming. The doors opened in unison, black umbrellas unfurling against the rain. Charles Whitmore stepped out first, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the mud. The man was older now, lines carved deep into his face, the weight of secrets and success eroding him from the inside out. But his eyes were sharp, predatory, and fixed on the cabin. "Come out," Whitmore called, his voice smooth as silk and sharp as glass. "Let's settle this." Jeremiah opened the door before anyone could stop him, stepping onto the porch. Ruth followed, her hand on his arm to steady the fury trembling beneath his skin. "What do you want?" Ruth called, her voice clear despite the fear tightening her throat. Whitmore smiled, the kind of smile that belonged to men who never heard the word no. "I want what's mine." "You burned a church to the ground," Jeremiah said, his voice low. "That wasn't yours." Whitmore took a step forward, rain sliding down his expensive overcoat. "Property is property. And you were supposed to disappear." "Well," Jeremiah said, fists clenching at his sides, "I'm still here." Whitmore's smile faltered, just for a second. Then his gaze slid past Jeremiah, into the cabin, to the small face peeking around the doorframe. "Ava. She's grown," Whitmore said, his voice almost gentle. "It's a shame she had to get caught up in this." Jeremiah stepped between them. "If you touch her," Whitmore sighed, feigning disappointment. "Always so emotional. That's why you were so easy to frame." "You left proof," Ruth said, holding up the cassette tape. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "That won't make it to court." "Wanna bet?" Detective Briggs stepped into the doorway, his badge glinting in the rain. "I sent a copy to the DA's office and to the press." For the first time, real fear flickered across Whitmore's face. "You think this ends with me?" Whitmore's voice dropped to a hiss. "There are others. You take me down. They'll replace me before my cell door closes." "Maybe," Jeremiah said. "But you won't be the man who took everything from me anymore." "Or from Eva," Ruth added. Whitmore's mask cracked, anger bleeding through. "You think you've won?" "No," Ruth said. "But we stopped being afraid." The arrest. Briggs stepped forward, cuffs in hand. "Charles Whitmore, you're under arrest for conspiracy, arson, obstruction of justice, and a list long enough to bury you." Whitmore's henchman took a step forward, but the sound of sirens, police, not his own, filled the air. "Looks like your friends aren't coming," Briggs said. Whitmore's lip curled, but there was nowhere left to run. The rain made his face slick, like oil floating on water, but his power evaporated the moment the cuffs snapped around his wrists. As the police took him away, Whitmore turned back once, his gaze burning into Ruth's. "This isn't over," he said. But Ruth didn't flinch. "Yes, it is," she said. Dawn after the storm. The rain had washed the air clean by morning. The cabin was quiet. The woods hushed as though holding their breath after the storm. Eva stood in the doorway, barefoot, the earth cool beneath her toes. The sunlight filtered through the trees, painting her curls gold. Jeremiah stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her small shoulder. "We're safe now?" she asked. Jeremiah knelt, eye level with her, his hands framing her face. "As long as I'm breathing, you're safe." Eva's arms wrapped around his neck, holding him tighter than before, as though she finally believed she wouldn't lose him again. Ruth stepped outside, the weight of exhaustion hanging on her shoulders, but her heart felt light. They weren't running anymore. They weren't hiding. They were free. Epilogue. 1 year later. The New Street Thomas Chapel stood tall against the afternoon sky, its white walls bright, its steeple reaching higher than before. The congregation gathered outside, laughing, hugging, a community healing, rebuilding from ashes. At the front stood Ruth, Ova perched on her hip, and Jeremiah beside them. No shackles, no shadows, just a man, a father, and a survivor. Eva slipped down, running to a patch of freshly turned soil beside the chapel steps. She knelt, patting the dirt, and stood back. A young tree, no taller than her, stood in the earth. "What kind of tree is it?" Jeremiah asked. "A sugar maple," Ruth said softly. "Strong roots." Jeremiah slipped his arm around Ruth's waist, the three of them standing together in the sun, a family born from fire and rebuilt in light. "Ready to go home?" Ruth asked. Jeremiah smiled, the first true smile in years. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home."